So do you want to configure a static IP address anytime any device ever moves from one location to another, from one wireless network to another, or to have to statically configure every time you add a new access point? Yeah, me neither. So we let DHCP take control of that type of service, right? We love it. It's been around forever. We've all used DHCP in our home networks, business networks. It applies the IP addresses dynamically per subnet accurately. It's good stuff. Our goal here is not to go into detail on how DHCP works, but let's remember that DHCP is a service that could be running here on a physical server, like a Windows server, a Linux server, something like that. It could be running here on a router, or it might be running over here on a layer 3 switch, like a Catalyst 3650, for example. So in any of those situations, we would need to configure DHCP to handle the pools of addresses needed by clients. So how many pools is that? Well, we'll need a pool for our access points. All of our access points should be associated with one pool of addresses that allows them to be able to communicate on the network immediately and get in cahoots with the controller, all that good stuff. We'll need to have one pool of addresses for each of our SSIDs. So if I've got a guest SSID over here, and then I also have a corporate SSID over here, well, those are going to need to have separate pools because remember, an SSID is going to translate to a VLAN, which is a broadcast domain, which is, of course, a subnet, a unique IP space. And DHCP is going to hand out the accurate layer 3 information to apply on top of that. So how does that work? Well, let's say you were there on the layer 3 switch and you wanted to configure that. Be pretty straightforward. All you would need to do is enter in something a bit like this, right? Let's say you wanted to support that guest pool of IP addresses right here. Well, you need the switch to have a virtual interface to communicate with those guests. That's what we see there, interface VLAN 14. You give it an IP address in the appropriate IP range. So it's whatever the IP scope is that you've assigned to that. In this case, I'm keeping it simple. 192.168.14 is the network, 14.254 the IP address here. Then, back in the global context, we'll issue the command IPDHCP pool and give it a name like guest for the guest network. Then we'll define the network ID of this pool, 192.168.14.0.255.255.255.0 in the DHCP context. We'll also here add the default-router command, which will tell them, how do I get off this crazy train? And the answer is through the interface that we specified right here. In other words, I'm your DHCP server and I'm your router between VLANs, because that's what a layer 3 switch is good at. And we're going to repeat that basic set of commands for each of our VLANs for each of our SSIDs. So for the corporate, let's say that was 11, interface VLAN 11, right? And give it the IP address like 11.254, and then we'll do an IP DHCP pool, call it corporate, and then give it an IP address of 192.168.11.254, right? Wash, rinse, repeat, and then we create the pool, and then we'll create the network 192.168.11.0, the subnet mask, and the default router 192.168.11.254. So for all the virtual interfaces in the switch, right? We create an 11 interface, we create a 14 interface, and we create a pool that is local to each of those interfaces. And therefore, when it hears a broadcast that matches that VLAN, so I hear something and it's on that particular VLAN, then I will be able to assign it an appropriate IP address from that scope. Now, with that said, don't forget about the access point. The access point we want to be dynamically configured as well. So once again, we're going to have a configuration necessary that will allow that to function correctly, that matches our scheme and then allows us to build that out. So what's that going to look like? Well, let's take a look. This is going to be pretty much the same as what we saw for our guest networks, for our client networks, with one addition. So we create an interface, we assign an IP address, we build a pool, and for this pool, again, we called it the AP pool, all right? Then we give it the network ID, we give it the default router, so much the same. One last option. One way to specify that I would like my DHCP server to tell my access points where the wireless LAN controllers are when they're not within broadcast range, when they're not on the same subnet, is by just informing them in the DHCP process. So Here's your IP address, 192.168.12.5. Oh, and by the way, here's option 43. If you're looking for a wireless LAN controller, he's over there. Now, the weird thing, of course, is that this is an IP address, but it's written in hexadecimal. So you will need to convert your IPv4 decimal address into hexadecimal in order to manage that. And again, you could do that with with whatever set of tools you need to make that happen, but you've got to provide it that accurate information because that's how it is stored inside of the DHCP configuration database, right? So you cannot type it in a decimal format. It has to be hexadecimal. And if I'm using an external DHCP service or the router, again, same basic process, but there'd be one slight difference. And that is if you are going to be using a remote DHCP server, then what you'll have to do is get your local layer 3 switch, right, keeping everything isolated into its own subnet, to forward those messages using the IP relay agent process. And that's pretty simple. For each of our subnets, what you would do is jump into the interface for that VLAN, that SVI interface, and then issue the IP helper address command, which tells it, oh yeah, there's a DHCP service, it's over there. And you specify the IP address of the server. Notice in this case, I've got one server for all my subnets. If they happen to be served by different DHCP servers, then you can point that out. And so you're pointing them to the external server or to the router, whatever server it is or device it is that is maintaining the database. And so then it just gets forwarded there, gets relayed back, and brought back to the client via the switch. So that functions as well if necessary. Remember, if we're supporting the access point, that would mean setting up option 43 on this pool or this pool in just the same way.